Picture this. You were standing on a sun-baked plain in late November, 1177. In front of you, 500 armored knights, their surcoats spotted with dust and blood, hold a ragged line. Behind them, about 3,000 local levies strain to steady shields and keep pace. And on the far horizon, the banners of an army, medieval sources put it at 26,000, ripple in the wind under the command of Saladin. Somewhere in the middle of that scene sits a man wrapped in bandages, the king of Jerusalem, his face masked to hide the ravages of a disease the world would call leprosy. The kingdom's fate, some contemporaries would later say, the fate of Christendom in the Levant, and perhaps beyond, hinges on a single decision. Before we go any further, I want to promise you 3 things that explain how this improbable hour unfolded. First, how Saladin's confidence turned into a tactical error. Second, why an elite cavalry force that seemed invincible briefly broke and fled. And third, how Baldwin IV, a teenage king physically ravaged by disease, supplied a moral authority that turned exhaustion into audacity. Those are the bones of the story. What follows is how those bones became flesh. The crisis begins in Jerusalem itself. The city's leaders had gathered, a council of magnates, military orders, and bishops, because the threat from Saladin was no longer a distant rumor. Since his rise, Saladin had united much of the Muslim Near East and was pressing against the patchwork of crusader states. He moved not as a single mindless mass, but as a commander who balanced force with cunning, raiding, blockading, besieging where he could, leaving other ground insecure to forage and consolidate supply. The kingdom of Jerusalem was stretched thin, its garrisons were small, its war chest had been drained by constant campaigns, men were tired. The council debated retreat, consolidation, perhaps abandoning the exposed towns and concentrating behind Jerusalem's walls. Into that room stepped Baldwin IV, a youth in years but an old man in pain. Contemporary Latin chronicles make a point of his appearance, bandages wrapped around his legs and hands, the mask covering his cheeks, a king whose body betrayed him even as his authority remained. Leprosy in the 12th century carried both physical suffering and social ambiguity. It could cripple the body, but it did not automatically strip a man of kingship. Baldwin's lineage and charisma had kept him on the throne. His voice, the chroniclers insist, had remained clear and direct. Some accounts record him refusing a flight that would abandon his realm to a victorious enemy. Others paint him as pushing for action, insisting that leadership is not preserved by hiding behind walls while the enemy grows bolder. What Baldwin did in that throne room mattered far beyond a single moral speech. It did something less measurable. It changed the chemistry of courage.
Men who were debating prudence felt the pull of purpose. A handful of knights, already exhausted by years of conflict and fearful for their homes, found in their king a reason to risk everything. That is the first subtle miracle of this tale. Not supernatural intervention, but the way moral force can multiply physical force. The chronicle voice that would later call it providence was often the same voice that watched aimless councils falter and then saw them held together by a single person's resolve. They decided to act, not to sally forth with a comfortable army, but to undertake a forced march, roughly 45 miles in little more than 36 hours, across terrain that was unfamiliar, hostile, and punctuated by ravines and stony gullies. The plan was not elegant, it was desperate. The objective, strike a blow before Saladin could consolidate occupied ground and before the kingdom's defenses collapsed under daily raids. The force was small because the only men available for a rapid reaction were those already near enough to ride without delay, the 500 mounted knights, heavy, armored, elite striking units, and a few thousand levies hastily mustered. Imagine that march. Picture the medieval plain as more than an open chessboard. Think of it as a furnace where metal sings. The November sun could still be down, armor turning to localized stoves around the torso and legs. Horses labored, their sides heaving, lather flicking the flanks. Many animals had been pushed to the limits, straps chafed the skin, horses tripped on rough ground, beasts that had not eaten proper grain in days were expected to carry men through exhaustion. The riders themselves endured the weight of mail and plate, faces streaked with sweat, bandages frayed, morale hanging by a thread. Contemporary accounts describe half-seeing visions as sleep and delirium crept in, soldiers hallucinated from fatigue. Baldwin himself was sometimes borne on a litter, his hands bandaged, the king who could not trust his own legs lending his name and presence to a column of desperate men. This is where the second revelation starts to matter. Saladin's confidence had not only made him bold, it had made him complacent. After earlier victories and a reputation for invincibility, Saladin allowed his forces to disperse for foraging and looting as he moved. If you are a commander with the momentum, you can afford to scatter detachments to gather supplies, seize wagons, and secure the local provisions that sustain an occupying army. Medieval logistics were precarious, supply trains were small and vulnerable, and maintaining them over long distances was always a gamble. Saladin judged, correctly in many situations, that the Crusaders were too timid to strike a scattered force. So he sent forward columns to gather food and plunder, set parts of his army to pillage the countryside, and temporarily left his central battle line thinner than it might have been otherwise.
He was not reckless so much as pragmatic. He was caught by a rare conjunction, a bold opponent under the leadership of a king whose presence could steel men, and the sheer physical improbability that 500 knights could cross so much ground so quickly. On the night the Crusader column moved, Saladin's men were spread out, wagons loaded, guards relaxed, and a substantial portion of his cavalry, including elite Mamluk horsemen, were doing what mounted troops often did between battles. They scouted, raided, and feasted on the spoils. Medieval sources emphasize that some of Saladin's elite riders had been detached or engaged in foraging. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers, like Ibn al-Athir, and Latin accounts differ in detail, but both show a commander who planned well and yet, on this occasion, accepted a risk that would be exploited. Before dawn, Baldwin's scouts, the unsung eyes and ears of any medieval army, slipped forward. They were the small, mobile detachments that lived on speed and silence. These scouts crept across dust trails and came back with news that made Baldwin's jaw harden. Saladin's forces were not in a single mass arrayed to meet a pitched attack. They were scattered. The enemy's camp was full of wagons and booty, the cavalry mixed with non-combatants and foragers. Some of Saladin's men were already dismantling defenses and distributing plunder. Others were soaking up the certainty of an expected victory. It happens more often than generals like to admit. The moment after triumph can become a vulnerability. Baldwin's moment of decision is the hinge of the story. He could have pulled back, retraced the exhausted column to safety, conceded ground and time. Instead, he ordered a council of the commanders, Templar Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand among them, and then directed the force forward. The move was audacious, a hammer blow targeted at the dispersed enemy, driven by the heavy cavalry that could turn shock into collapse. The plan relied on surprise and speed. It required, paradoxically, both brute force and exquisite timing. Baldwin's presence mattered because the knights were not simply following orders, they were stepping into an act given moral sanction by their king. They believed, or at least hoped, that if their sovereign stood at the head of the spear, the gods of honor would not desert them. Again, chroniclers frame this in religious language. They say God favored the bold. Modern historians will point to morale as a measurable combat multiplier. Both perspectives have truth. Here, moral force and opportunity met logistical surprise. They struck at dawn. The Templar Order, those warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims and the holy places, formed the spear of the attack. Odo de Saint-Amand, the Templar Grand Master, led his men in a wedge, a formation designed to crash through a line of enemy cavalry and infantry. The noise was immediate, iron on leather, horses screaming, shields clashing. For a moment, all standard war rules seemed suspended. The Templar wedge hit the center of Saladin's dispersed force and would not be turned. This brings us to the third revelation. Why did elite cavalry, regarded as the finest horsemen of the age, begin to falter? The Mamluk horsemen and other cavalry elements that had dominated the field were superbly trained. Their horses could outpace and outmaneuver most opponents. Their tactics involved feigned retreats, missile volleys from horseback, and disciplined charges. But when the Templar wedge slammed into a thin center, the result was psychological and tactical. Shock breaks cohesion. When your line is punched through, you either counterpunch with reserves or you begin to fall back. Saladin had fewer immediate reserves in a concentrated formation because, again, he had accepted a distributed footprint to maintain foraging and logistics. That allowed the heavy knights to isolate and smash. More than that, the terrain did something neither side fully anticipated. There were ravines and gullies, typical features of the southern Levant, that sat as traps between ridgelines. Baldwin and his scouts had noticed these hollows. What looked on the surface like simple open ground was in fact stitched with dead ground where infantry could hide and with ravines that would turn a mounted retreat into a deadly bottleneck. As the cavalry on Saladin's side tried to fall back under the weight of the Templar assault, they found their avenues of retreat narrowed, horses stumbled, ranks pressed into one another, and the noise of panic multiplied. A chaotic fallback across broken ground is rarely an orderly retreat. It becomes final.
This is the core tactical moment, a concentrated charge into a dispersed army that, due to terrain, could not remain fluid. The Templars drove a wedge into the center. Baldwin, who by many accounts had rarely roamed far from the size of a man's litter, but now was seen on horseback signaling and encouraging, became a focus point. Whether he rode in full or was supported on a mule or litter varies by source. What matters is that his presence at the battlefield's leading edge reinforced the image that these knights were not acting on a whim, but on the authority of their king. The sight of a masked, bandaged king raising his hand or signaling a charge had a disproportionate psychological effect. For the defenders who saw such a figure unbowed, terror and hope can switch places. At the same time, infantry hidden in the dead ground, levies who had been positioned to take advantage of the ravines, rose and struck the flanks of the fleeing horsemen. A cavalry retreat that suddenly takes missile fire or faces spearmen in a narrow pass loses the ability to reform. In narratives of warfare across the ages, you see the same pattern. Cavalry excels where it can maneuver, infantry wins where it can fix and funnel. Here, the flat plain with its deceptive hollows allowed infantry to transform a tactical retreat into a massacre. Arrows, javelins, and pikes from the levies compounded the failure of disorganized cavalry. And horses, as animals, panic. They crash into one another, they fall, and men are thrown into piles. I should stress what medieval chroniclers claim and how modern historians interpret those claims. Several Latin accounts assert that tens of thousands were killed. Some go as high as 20,000 dead in the rout. Ibn al-Athir and other Muslim chroniclers give similarly catastrophic figures, though the exact numbers vary wildly by source. Modern scholars approach medieval casualty figures with caution. They often represent the emotional magnitude of a defeat more than precise arithmetic. Even allowing for exaggeration, what is indisputable is that Saladin's army suffered a shattering reversal. The material loss of wagons and treasure, the death or capture of many soldiers, and the sudden collapse of morale that turned an anticipated victorious occupation into a panicked withdrawal. The pursuit after the initial blow is a grim but necessary part of the story. Once the enemy's cohesion broke, the Crusaders chased them down, not merely to kill, but to seize what mattered: supplies, baggage, and a treasury that Saladin had expected to move into his newly gained territory. Contemporary accounts emphasize the capture of significant spoil: weapons, silver, and provisions, items that, for a medieval polity under constant strain, translated directly into the ability to finance fortifications and recruit fighters. In a world without centralized tax systems and modern banking, a single captured war chest could fund defenses and restore an exhausted state more effectively than months of slow tributes. The immediate strategic consequences were stark. The Crusader states were given breathing room. The money and supplies seized at Montchassard, the place where this battle would be remembered, helped finance fortifications and buy time. Material gain aside, the psychological effect rippled across both sides. For the Crusaders, a near-hopeless gamble had succeeded. Morale surged. For many Muslim chroniclers, the defeat was a shock that required theological and political explanation. Some contemporaries explain the victory as divine favor for the Christians. Muslim writers had to account for a reversal that did not fit easy narratives of Saladin's competence. None of this negates Saladin's overall strategic prowess. He would remain a formidable figure who later retook Jerusalem. But for a time, the momentum had shifted. The human cost, again, requires careful phrasing. Medieval sources speak of carnage. Modern readers should understand that such language, while emotionally accurate, is not intended as celebration. Battles are brutal and tragic.
The men on both sides were often of similar social station: farmers, professional soldiers, and mercenaries fighting under lords' banners. Contemporary chroniclers, Christian and Muslim alike, recorded the dead to assign meaning and to mark the scale of the event. Whether the exact toll was 5,000 or 20,000, the result was the same in political terms. Saladin's immediate mobility and capacity to hold the field were compromised. The Crusaders won a respite. There is an element of contingent fortune here that historians love to unpack. If just a few factors had shifted, if Baldwin had been too ill to travel, if Saladin had kept his force tightly concentrated, if the ravines had not existed, or if the scouts had failed to find the dispersal, history might have tilted a different way. The phrase "hours from falling" in our title is not mere hyperbole. Chroniclers and later generations viewed Montchassard as a moment when the momentum of conquest could have become the near-permanent possession of one power. For European Christendom, the loss of Jerusalem and the rout of its defenders could have erased the fragile buffer that the Crusader states provided to Western pilgrims and political interests in the region. That is why, in the imagination of Western chroniclers, this battle acquired the quality of a narrow escape. But there is another, quieter lesson trailing behind the noise of spears and the flutter of banners. Leadership under suffering matters. Baldwin IV did not command an empire of unlimited resources. He had a body betraying him, a crown that sometimes felt like a liability more than an honor. Yet his presence at Montgasard exerted an effect disproportionate to his physical capacity. That kind of moral authority is not mystical, it is social physics. People follow those who embody a cause when others are unsure. They replicate courage when someone authoritative models it. Baldwin's leprosy made his action more astonishing to contemporaries. The image of a masked king, bandaged and frail, still hurling himself into his realm's defense, made for a narrative that medieval scribes would return to again and again. Saladin's recovery after Montgasard underscores the complexity of this moment. He was not broken, and he did not lose the strategic initiative forever. In subsequent years, he repaired his losses, reorganized his forces, and mounted campaigns that would eventually culminate in the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. Montgasard did not change the broader arc of the Levant's history. It changed the timing. It was a delay with high human and political cost for everyone involved. For the Crusader states, those extra years mattered. They allowed time for new defenses, for reinforcements from Europe to arrive, and for their narrative of legitimacy to be bolstered. For Saladin, Montgasard became a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of not dispersing forces when opportunities for decisive action remained.
There are a few technical points worth pausing on because they speak to how we remember such events. The composition of the Crusader force included not just knights, but military orders like the Knights Templar, led by Odo de Saint-Amand, as well as contingents from regional lords such as Raymond of Tripoli and the famously unpredictable Reynald of Chatillon. Those names carry weight in medieval chronicles because they represent the complex web of loyalty, rivalry, and piety that drove Crusader politics. On the Muslim side, Saladin's command included diverse contingents, disciplined cavalry, Mamluk units, slave soldiers who formed an elite corps, local levies, and tribal auxiliaries. The battle, therefore, was not between neat monolithic armies, but between coalitions with differing levels of cohesion and different expectations of the spoils. One must also track the language of medieval testimony. When Latin chroniclers wrote of divine favor, they were not fabricators. They were people interpreting events inside a worldview in which God regularly intervened in human affairs. Similarly, some Muslim chroniclers tried to reconcile defeat with divine providence and the rigor of military duty. As historians, we translate those theological claims into what they often reflect, people trying to make sense of contingency and chaos. To say that chroniclers called the victory divine is not to endorse a supernatural cause, it is to record how people at the time understood what had happened. And yet, even with such caution, narrative needs flesh. The moment of the charge is vivid in every account. Thunderous hooves, the clink and screech of iron, dust kicked into a pall that turned the day into a swirling gray. The Templars in their white surcoats with red crosses drive a blade-shaped wedge into the enemy's center. Knights fall, horses tumble, commanders shout, a king wrapped in bandage signals with a gloved hand, and men press forward because they believe in that hand. The Mamluk and Ayyubid horsemen try to rally, but the narrow ground and the sudden appearance of infantry on the flanks turn a retreat into a rout. The pursuers, fueled by adrenaline and the smell of victory, press until the disorder becomes irreversible. After the slaughter, the Crusaders found not only bodies but treasure, wagons filled with plunder, silk, coin, and food. Contemporary accounts describe the capture of stores that had been intended to support Saladin's occupation and further operations. Those supplies did practical work. They financed garrisoning, repairs, and recruitment. In a region where money moves armies, that windfall was not trivial. It also functioned symbolically. The sight of crusaders carrying away the spoils of a would-be conqueror became a potent image in Western letters. Time, however, has an iron will. Baldwin IV would not long outlive his triumph.
The disease that marked his reign continued to claim him, and he died a few years later, a victim of the same malady that had made his victory at Montgisard so remarkable. Saladin, wounded in pride and in resources, would return stronger. By 1187, the political geography of the region had shifted again. Jerusalem would fall to Saladin in that year, a seismic event that reshaped Christian-Muslim relations in the Levant. So the question most people ask is fair. Did Montchizard change history? The truthful answer is both yes and no. It changed the timetable and afforded the Crusader states valuable breathing room. It gave Europe months, perhaps years, to respond or to reorient. It did not, in the end, secure a lasting Christian hold on Jerusalem. Historical change is rarely simple. It is the accumulation of moments like Montchizard, sudden, contingent, and consequential. There is a final moral observation folded into the military one. Battles are measured by maps and coins and casualty lists, but they are also measured by stories. The story of a masked king leading exhausted men across strange ground to shock an invader resonated because it fit existing narratives: courage against odds, the young king who bore suffering without shrinking, warriors who become instruments of history. Chronicles shaped later memory. Poets and storytellers turned Montchizard into an emblem of narrow escape. For modern audiences, the event invites reflection on leadership, the limits of calculation, and the elasticity of human courage. It shows us that numerical inequality, 500 against 26,000 according to some medieval accounts, does not always determine outcomes. Morale, terrain, timing, and the fragile human quality of conviction can tip scales the arithmetic alone fails to predict. We should also remember the people on the other side of the banners. The Kurd Saladin was no caricature. He was a complex leader capable of both ruthlessness and magnanimity, and of strategic patience. His dispersal of forces was not stupidity, it was a tactical choice that had served him well in the past. The Mamluks were not simply faceless horsemen, they were a professional corps that would later form the backbone of powerful states. Chroniclers from both traditions recorded loss and valor. In remembering Montchizard, we should honor the seriousness of combatants on all sides without turning suffering into a spectacle. So why does the title say Europe was hours from falling? Because in the imagination of contemporaries and in the precarious calculus of medieval power, the loss of Jerusalem and the collapse of the Crusader defense could have caused a cascade, more territory falling, pilgrim routes closed, and a political domino effect that would have pushed the frontier of Muslim control far into areas Europeans viewed as critical to their religious and strategic interests.
Montchizard did not determine whether Europe would fall in any literal sense, but it was, for a brief and decisive motion, a hinge that kept certain doors unopened. If this tale of rash courage, tactical chance, and the king's impossible authority has gripped you, consider subscribing. There are deeper dives into the commanders, the orders, and the chroniclers who tell this story. Stick around, because understanding Montchizard fully means reading different voices and weighing their claims. In closing, here are the measured takeaways. Saladin's temporary dispersal of forces created a window. Baldwin's moral authority converted despair into daring. The Templar charge, amplified by terrain and hidden infantry, turned a rout into a slaughter whose numbers medieval sources magnified, but which modern historians still regard as strategically decisive. The immediate spoils funded defenses and bought the Crusader states time. The longer arc returned to its original momentum, with Saladin eventually reasserting control and retaking Jerusalem a decade later. Montchizard matters because it concentrates all the themes we tend to study in medieval warfare: leadership under suffering, the interplay of morale and mathematics, the tyranny of logistics, and the way contingency can rewrite short stretches of history. For further reading, consult the contemporary chronicles, Latin narratives of the period, and Muslim historians like Ibn al-Athir, while keeping in mind their differing perspectives and occasional numerical exaggerations. Modern historians provide critical analysis that helps sort likely fact from rhetorical flourish. If you want a starting list, look at Ibn al-Athir for the Muslim perspective, the Latin chronicles for Christian narratives, and recent scholarly works that analyze logistics, terrain, and medieval military institutions. History, at its best, resists simple endings. Montchizard was not a miracle that permanently altered destiny, nor was it a minor skirmish misremembered. It was a single, startling hour when courage and chance intersected, and for a time kept a kingdom, and with it a continent's projected sense of security, from falling.